You may be seated. A reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 11, verse 27, through chapter 12, verse 20. These are the family records of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans during his father Terah's lifetime. Abram and Nahor took wives. Abram's wife was named Sarai, and Nahor's wife was named Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was unable to conceive. She did not have a child. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, Haran's son, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son, Abram's wife, and they set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and died in Haran. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem, at the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. He built an altar to the Lord there, and he called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev. There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while, because the famine in the land was severe. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "Look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me but let you live. Please say that you're my sister, so that it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, so the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. He treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She's my sister,' so that I took her as my wife? Now, here's your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. It's lovely to see everybody, all your bright and shiny faces, even though a lot of you have been in class since 8 this morning. I hope you had some strong coffee before you walked in. I want to recognize just a couple people. I want to thank Zach and the worship team for leading us so faithfully in worship before the Lord, and thank you for making it possible to sing all my favorite songs. I also want to recognize some of our congregants from Meadowbrook Baptist Church, where my husband and I attend, where my husband's on staff as the minister to senior adults. Our pastor's here. He canceled their staff meeting, apparently, and so they're here. And they lead us faithfully in worship every week, and I hope that you are ministered to today. Actually, Our pastor, Chris Jones, is a 2-time graduate of Beeson, and actually when he finished his Doctor of Ministry, that was my first semester coming here, and I actually prayed over him. And I'm just thinking that maybe that's why he does such a great job at our church. It's also lovely to share the platform with some of my very favorite people and dear friends, and of course my husband John, who is my partner in this sojourn of life and who helps me so well keeping in check those very well-behaved teenagers that we have. And also I want to just say a word to my cousins who are in Romania watching the live stream across the globe. Hey guys, and try not to do too much texting here, because this is where my Bible is. All right. Well, our series this year, as set by our dean, A Dwelling Place for God by the Spirit, concerns God's call to form and set apart for himself a people who will be a light to the Gentiles, in Isaiah's terms. We want to look at the ways in which the Lord has shaped and led his chosen people through history, as also the ways that God has always dwelled with those he has called. That's straight from the syllabus that he gave us last week. And, I always try to read the syllabus carefully so that I can do the assignment properly. And I hope that I will have done a good job with this prompt, Dr. Sweeney. Well, all these themes that are in the syllabus are especially true of Abraham. He is called, set apart as favored, and protected. He is shaped in a divine discipleship across the pages of Genesis. And even though Abraham is a sojourner and he's consistently mobile, and yet we find even in our text today that God met him and dwelled with him at various places in that journey. Let's start at the beginning. God had a plan that began with Eden. That was a place, a special and perfect and wonderful place in which God dwelt with and walked with his people, both of them, Adam and Eve. Eden was a place of beauty, of richness, of goodness and abundance and fruitfulness, of life and light and blessing. And all these goods derived from God's presence and favor. Eden was a place of companionship, of partnership and collaboration, tending, stewarding, and protecting, guarding God's garden. God's good plan was somewhat interrupted when the serpent reared his ugly head and told his ugly lies, but it wasn't thwarted and will never be so. God's plan to create and bless and to fill the earth with his knowledge and glory was not thwarted by the serpent's deception and usurping of joy and divine human intimacy, nor in the taking of women by heavenly beings, by the great and powerful men of old, seeing what they want, seeing who they want, and taking them, taking hold. God's plan to multiply humans who will bear his image and populate the earth is not thwarted when one image bearer murders another, nor when one murders many others. The kind of house cleaning that was necessary through the flood also did not thwart God's plan, for he saved a remnant. He spared a family, a household whose patriarch walked with God, who obeyed in faith, as Hebrews 11 recounts that Noah, being warned by God about events yet unseen, no one had ever seen anything like that, and yet in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. And we're reminded in a brief sentence at the height of the water level on the earth, after decreation and the floodwaters have ravaged and drowned and destroyed and covered over everything, a little phrase, Genesis 8:1, God remembered Noah. This is not the opposite of forgetting. An omniscient God doesn't forget. Rather, it is a salvific remembering, as God keeps his protective eye on those who are his. And afterwards, creation was renewed, as were God's promises to bless and God's command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And when people did not spread out over the earth to carry out God's desires, but rather decided to band together, plant themselves in a land like Shinar, and aspire to take hold of heavenly heights to which they had no valid claim, and who vaunt themselves proudly and aspire to take God's place, those events at Babel still don't thwart God's plan or his desires to redeem his good creation and its creatures. The name and fame that they sought are only God's and his to give. And give it he did to the traveler in today's text, to Abram. Let's look at Abram's family just a little bit. Abraham, we call him Abraham now, but Abram, father of a great nation, was a venerable covenant patriarch, eventually, not necessarily in our narratives today, but he originated in Mesopotamia. Whether he was originally from Ur or originally from Haran is not completely clear in the text. All up and down the Tigris and Euphrates river system between Ur in the south of Iraq and Haran to the north, even the north of the apex of what we call the Fertile Crescent, there was a shared culture, a shared trade, and a shared worship of the moon god Shin, surely one of the gods beyond the river that Joshua refers to in his ultimatum to Israel right before his retirement in Joshua 24. Abram himself derives from the line of Shem, Noah's son. Abram is the eldest son of the three sons of Terah, as Shem was also the eldest of three. This Shem, whose name means name, has a line that progresses to a point and then divides. One direction of his life descends to Babel, as those people aim to grasp at a name for themselves. And the other direction descends to the subject of our text, Shem's descendant Abram, who, as we'll see, is promised, among other blessings, a name from the only one who can truly bestow such blessings. Well, genealogies are very interesting in and of themselves, and they're very important to the Jews. And there are a lot of them in the book of Genesis, but even as we think of them in the background of our text, they can serve to emphasize the title of today's message. The journey and the plan for Abraham doesn't start in chapter 12. It rather precedes Abram. Abram, then, to narrow our focus even a bit more, is the eldest son of Terah and the grandson of Nahor, which seems to be a family name. Abram also has a brother named Nahor and a youngest brother named Haran. And at the time of Haran's birth, the family lived in Ur of the Chaldees. Haran bears a son named Lot, who we know, and it appears he also had two daughters, Milcah and Iscah, and then Haran passes away. It appears that Abram and Nahor, the two brothers, take in their deceased brother's children, as Nahor marries his niece, Milcah, and we assume he takes in Iscah too, about whom we hear nothing more. And Abram, as the eldest son, takes responsibility for his nephew, Lot. Last of all, a little bit surprising, I think, Abram's wife is introduced, a lovely woman, Sarai, whose name means my princess. Nahor and Milcah have formed what we would call a close kin marriage of uncle and niece, but in a later text, we find a detail that's withheld from us right here for its dramatic effect in a later similar narrative. Sarai and Abram are even closer, for Sarai is Abram's half-sister, since Terah is her father too, but with a different wife. Rounding off the introductions is a final detail that functions as an identifier, a dominant and disheartening characteristic of Sarai's that seems to cast a shadow and complicate the dynamics of the following narratives. Sarai is infertile, and the text tells us this doubly. She's unable to conceive, and she has no child. As we get closer to our examination of God's call to Abram and his family, we might consider a few other textual questions. This come up for me. Why did the family move from Ur to Haran? And what family members are involved? Our text tells us that Terah took Abram, Sarai, and Lot and traveled north, and the others seem to have stayed behind. And their intent was to go to Canaan from the beginning. But once they arrived in Haran, which is out of the way and further north than they needed to go if they were going to go south to Canaan, after they go over the hump, they settled in Haran. And it seems that later, more members of the family joined them, since in the next generation, we see Milcah and Nahor's son, Bethuel, has settled in the region of Haran in a city called Aram Naharaim. But what was the impetus for the itinerary to Canaan in the first place? Because, see, we kind of think from chapter 12:1 that that's the first time that God told Abram to go on down into Canaan. But here, I would say, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and also Dr. Ken Matthews' excellent Genesis commentary can serve us very well. And I highly recommend his newly updated commentary in the New American Commentary series. Ken Matthews, Beeson Prof. Let's have a look at Abram's call then. Anytime I've read this passage of 12:1, God's call to Abram seems so all of a sudden, as if it's out of the blue. And Abram just obeys immediately. But is it possibly not the first time the call has come to Abram? It seems likely that it was not, which takes away nothing from Abram's obedience. But it does underline our theme today. This call originated in Ur, as God brought Abram from there, specifically directing him to Canaan for his own purposes, for God's own purposes. And an intriguing New Testament text that sheds light on this theme, the sermon of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, offers this recap of Abram's call in Acts 7. "Brothers and fathers," he said, "listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he settled in Haran, and said to him, 'Leave your country and relatives and come to the land that I will show you.' Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this land in which you are now living. He didn't give him an inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground, but he promised to give it to him as a possession and to his descendants after him, even though he was childless." Well, and back in Genesis, we find a few chapters later in Genesis 15, immediately after the incredible statement that Abram believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness, God states in the very next verse, "I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess." God's call to Abram happened much sooner, in the heart of idolatrous Ur. The living God, the God of glory, appeared to Abram, and Abram followed even then. What did this call entail? Well, Abram was asked to leave his past behind and entrust his extended family to the Lord who was calling him. He was asked to leave his land in exchange for another one TBD. You know what? I'll show you, right? He was asked to leave his clan, his relatives, his family network. But the strongest bond he was asked to sever was his father's house. He would be possibly seen as abrogating his role as eldest son. And related to this, he was asked to leave behind his inheritance, of which, as the eldest son, he should have received a double portion, one for him and a second one to use as needed to care for any member of the family that needed support. Finally, he'd be leaving his gods behind. And the household gods are also in some way connected to the eldest son's inheritance prerogatives. Leaving all these behind then opens him up, frees him, I would say, to become the covenant patriarch that we know he will become, together with his family, gradually discipled, story by story, by the Lord, who called them out. So what are these promised blessings? Incredible blessings. We see what God called Abram out from, but now what was God calling Abram to? He's calling him to the promises of blessing that resound as thickly as in the Garden of Eden, where God's blessing was abundant. Every day brought a blessing from God. Abram will be given a land. He will be made into a great nation. He'll be multiplied and he'll be blessed. He will have a great name and himself be a blessing to others. And he will receive a personal blessing and also protection vis-a-vis outsiders whose fortunes will vary, and this is what we see in the next story, whose fortunes will vary depending on their treatment of Abram. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, those who treat you disdainfully or make you nothing. All of a sudden, then, the scope broadens out with God's universal intentions. He says, all the families of the earth will be blessed or will bless themselves through you. We have here the idea that God has determined to bless Abram and all that is his, and has left open the possibility of blessing for those who attach themselves to Abram and who treat him well. But those who curse him or mistreat him will be cursed. This double principle of favor and protection is then worked out in his life's narratives, beginning with the very next pericope in verses 10 to 20. Now, these certainly are grand promises that sound nearly impossible. It seems unbelievable to promise a childless person of 75, married to a barren person of 65, that they will be multiplied so much so that they will produce a nation. And it's just as impossible to believe God's promise of a land gift when, as Abram is traversing Canaan as a nomad, we get these notes in the text. The Canaanites are in the land. The land's inhabited. It's not empty. It's not empty. The people are there. So, seeing this, how does Abram respond to these impossible-sounding promises? Well, Abram's response is obedient faith. This is what we see from him in verses 4 to 9. Abram went out obediently. You can't quite capture this as it is in the original, but God told Abraham, go out, and then in verse 4 it says, and Abram goed. God said, go, and Abram goed, right? He went out obediently, taking his immediate family, Sarai and Lot, and it is true that they do have a lot of wealth and people in their caravan. They are multiplying and being fruitful, even though Abram technically lacks an heir. Verse 5 is clear that they're going into the land. So he's going right where God told him. They went to go out to the land of Canaan, and so they came to the land. Abram passed through the land, and he came to a place. To the site of Shechem, where there was a known sacred landmark. And at this place, it says that God appeared to Abram. God appeared to Abram as a reassurance and a reconfirmation of the promises that, yes, this land would indeed become his inheritance. Abram acknowledges God's confirmation by setting up a place of worship. He sets up an altar there at Shechem, which would later become a significant patriarchal city, a significant site both for Jews and eventually for the Samaritans. Through the next few verses, we're given to understand that this was Abram's procedure as he sojourned through the length of the land. He was moving south into the desert country of the Negev down toward Egypt. He pitched his tent wherever God appeared to him. He built an altar for his household to worship, and he dwelt there for a time. His next stop was Bethel, or near Bethel, another sacred site that became a significant center of worship and actually a rival center of Yahweh worship, rival to Jerusalem. It wasn't called Bethel at the time of Abram, though, but it will be renamed as such by Abram's grandson, Jacob, as he passed through that location on his own journey in exactly the opposite direction to Abram because he's fleeing from his brother Esau. Bethel was the place of Jacob's amazing dream of the ladder that reached to heaven, and he called it the house of God, Beth El, and the gate of heaven. Abram, for his part, at the altar at Bethel, he called on the name of the Lord. Well, The Blessing Begins is a title that Dr. Matthews has for this section, but I wonder, don't tell him that I said that, but that I question this, but I just wonder, maybe this is kind of bringing the reader to ask themselves, is the blessing possibly endangered? Are the promises endangered? Because look what's starting to happen here in verses 10 and forward. As the text continues, Abram and Sarai's situation becomes very fraught, and the promises of God are put to the test. There's a drought, even a severe drought. Maybe that means that the goodness or the fruitfulness of the land is at risk. Maybe it's not as good of a land as God promised. Feeling forced to move into Egyptian territory to survive, Abram feels vulnerable, fearful, and he resorts to a ruse. Though technically true, but he resorts to a ruse for self-preservation, despite promises that God gave him of blessing and of protection. Sarah's regal beauty becomes a liability, and Abram asks her to cover for him. Rather than trusting God, Abram relies on Sarai, who he's willing to endanger, to make things go well for him. Right? So things will go well for me because of you. And as a result, Sarai is placed at risk. A more powerful man who controls the territory and takes what he wants for himself places Sarai's womb in danger, potentially compromising the heir that is to be born. Pharaoh's officials are called princes in the text. So it's interesting, the text reads that Pharaoh's princes saw this woman whose name means princess, just emphasizing that she fits well in a royal household. But, Sarai wasn't invited. She didn't get a special invitation into Pharaoh's household. It wasn't like a privilege. Sarah is taken to Pharaoh's household. She's taken to the royal harem, most likely. So for now, Abram is safe and well-treated and growing wealthier, but he's beholden to Pharaoh because Pharaoh has taken his wife, though in ignorance. But obviously, Sarai is indispensable to the covenant promises, and Abram can't just leave without her. So he's seemingly stuck and can do nothing because he's in a weak position. So are the promises then called into question? Well, then the Lord steps in. Isn't it nice when he does? Though culturally acceptable as a form of diplomacy and treaty making in order to keep peace in an area where nomadic groups come and go, crossing in and out of territories, nonetheless, taking Sarai was akin to the actions of seeing, desiring, and taking, like the forbidden fruit. Okay, again, we have echoes of Eden. Although ignorant, Pharaoh was nonetheless arrogant, and he had treated Sarai and Abram with contempt, drawing God's ire and punishment. We're meant to understand what happens next as God's protection, bringing the promised curse to bear, applying it. The text reads in a way probably familiar to us that God plagued Pharaoh with severe plagues because of Sarai. Though Pharaoh is rapacious, God intervenes and turns the tables. Abram is blessed and has been enriched, thus despoiling the Egyptians. Sarai is protected and released. And the covenant family, with a reputation now for being protected by a higher power, returns to the promised land. Well, they've been expelled with the same wording of go, except where God said, go out from your land, Pharaoh said, get out. Take all your people and get out. And so the covenant family goes back to the promised land to wait on the fulfillment of the divine promises. This event is part of the divine discipleship of Abram and Sarai and Lot under God's hand as they learn to trust God and to allow God to shape them into covenant people. And as readers, we begin to feel like we're reading a different story, but a familiar one. And the connections are marked, indicating that we're supposed to be thinking that way. These events are clearly prototypical. That is, they're a prototype or a predictor of Abram's family's future experience in Egypt, and they constitute the Exodus event in Nuche. The message here, as in Exodus, is the same. God delivers on his promises of blessing to Abram and does not abandon his people, but rather rescues them from their enemies. He settles them in their own land and will cause them to flourish under God's reign and in his presence. And now the words that many congregants look forward to. In conclusion, we've been focusing on Abram and his family for our talking points today. But if we were to focus on God, I think we could summarize our theme kind of like this: God appears and calls. God calls to blessings and promises, and God keeps his promises and rescues his people. So what do these things mean for us? What do they mean for you and for me? First, well, 3 points, of course, okay? First, this is not your journey alone. For many of you, this is a new season of life, many new beginnings and changes. God calls you as he called Abram. But Abram doesn't go alone. He takes his wife, his father, his nephew. He doesn't abrogate his responsibility to family, and they're on the move with him, bound together in this journey and following the call of a different God than those beyond the river. This is a self-revealing, personal, and living God, and so it is with us. Spouses, parents, children, anyone who comes and goes out with you. Don't minimize their participation with you, and be mindful that this is their journey too. I guess I want to especially emphasize those of you who are married, who are students here, and have a spouse who is not here, but who has come with you, and children who have come with you. Don't minimize their participation. This is their journey too. Acknowledge their experience. Include them in your decision making. Make wise decisions for them when called on to do that, and as much as possible, protect them from harm. 2, the one who promised is faithful. The God who calls and promises and blesses is the same God who delivers and rescues and keeps his word. Abram is asked to live in a land inhabited by others with the promise of eventual ownership, which he won't even live to see. He won't even see with his own eyes. But he dwelt there by faith, not sight. And while he's waiting, we see him in other stories engaging with those around him in the land, those more powerful and owners of those territories. Abram is respectful, peaceable. He acts with integrity. He rightly leans into and lives out the promise to make his name great. God gives him favor before others, and it's obvious to them. For us, we need to remember that the God who called us, who calls you into relationship with him, and who invited you into specialized training to share his name, to minister on his behalf, to reach out to the nations, to all the families of the earth. This is where we are, brothers and sisters. Near and far, he calls you to be fruitful for him. He wants us to engage those among whom we live in ways that honor God. And we should have no concern about how God will use our witness or bless us, but should seek to be a conduit of blessing to others. We do this by faith, like Abram, because we don't know the future, and we leave it in God's hands, and we seek his approval alone. This is the journey, being discipled by the example of God's work in the lives of our forebears. We must keep believing, obeying, living righteously, worshiping as Abram did, even not being certain of the specifics of the future. Abram and Sarai's faith is based on the faithfulness of God, demonstrated by his appearances through their journey, but also by actually showing up in their direst hours. The couple's situation in Egypt was dangerous for Abram, but it must have been terrifying for Sarai, as she's used as a diplomatic pawn and must countenance the possibility of sexual harm. I can only imagine her wonder, relief, joy, and whatever other emotions she may have felt when the plagues began in Pharaoh's household, and it was realized that the afflictions of Pharaoh were the finger of God on her behalf. God had not forgotten her there, buried in Pharaoh's household. She may have experienced a glimmer of hope in her life as the wife of a nomadic tribal leader. Perhaps she thought that maybe all is not lost by the power of this God who makes promises, and she might have felt some hope at that point for her future as mother of all these promised nations of whom Abram was to be the father. Hebrews 11:11 insists that by faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received the power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. Well, I don't know how much easier it became for her to trust, since she continued to be tested, and from this time, there still remained 25 years into the future for the promise of her fruitfulness to come true in the child Isaac. Last, these narratives constitute the discipling of our faith ancestors, and they teach us too that this covenant God leads and accompanies and appears in places along our journey as we seek, like Abram and Sarai, a permanent city made by God in which to dwell with him. But what a comfort it is that in the meantime, while we're still sojourners, while we're still foreigners and temporary residents on the earth, God meets us, appears to us, reassures us of his presence, blessing, and power to redeem and rescue. He is faithful to see his promises through because, as Paul says, he cannot deny himself. May we trust him more each day, serving with obedience and faithfulness, leaving the outcomes of our past and futures to his kind providence. Amen.